Chapter 6 in the Parsons textbook turns from the role that people play in selecting their government and the government's legitimacy to the role that citizens play in guiding the country on political, economic, and social issues. The role that social movements have in pushing for policy changes is a big question in political science, even though in the past the discipline did not look at these matters very closely. Figure 6-1 shows the different categories of political participation. What is seen as a continuum from low intensity of individual expression to very high intensity. Lower intensity involvement looks like announcing one's political views, putting a bumper sticker on one's car, or flying a flag. Collective action is the next level of involvement and includes voting, joining a party, or supporting one with money and time, joining public demonstrations or legal protests, civil disobedience, and sit-ins and boycotts. The next level is leading collective action, where you take a more responsible role in collective action. The next role, or perhaps parallel level, is professional politics, where you accept paid work to affect public officials' choices, run for or hold public office, work for the government, etc. And then you have riots, insurgency, and terrorism behaviors, which are generally viewed as illegitimate forms of protest compared to legal protest and civil disobedience. The debate gets confusing here, since protests that start out legal and as civil disobedience sometimes escalate for a number of reasons, including misbehavior of protesters, fights due to the presence of counter-protesters, or even actions by police. Some protests are by nature very exciting events and can be difficult for perpetrators of looting or violence to be identified, and very often the rhetoric opposing the protest can rely on these actions to delegitimate the cause. Current events are extremely relevant to this today. A theory of collective action originally came from Anthony Downs, who, ironically, wrote during a time of relative domestic calm in the United States. He suggested that the reason Americans did not protest much was because they were rational and realized that there was too much at risk and not enough reward for them to participate in rebellion against the government. He argued that the type of collective action needed to affect social and political change was so great that it would be too hard to compel people to take the risk. However, a problem existed for those who were willing to take the time and energy and potential punitive risks associated with protesting. Those who did not protest would still get the public benefit if they managed to effect change. And this calculation would mean that free riders would essentially ride on the efforts of others. The same logic was applied to voting and is referred to as Downs' paradox. Meaningful democracy requires participation, but it is irrational to vote, considering that one vote by itself makes no difference, and it is very costly in time and effort to vote. The way that social movement organizations and states have dealt with the free rider problem is through providing selective incentives in the first case. Members who are actively engaged may have access to certain benefits that non-participants do not, and compulsory voting, which makes not voting illegal and may impose penalties such as fines. Table 6-2 reports different types of political participation among different countries. Among countries that qualify as non-democracies, signing petitions is a very uncommon practice, as is boycotting, while demonstrating and voting are more common practices. However, among democracies, there is quite the variation. The United States has low voter turnout compared to most other democracies listed here, as well as low participation in demonstrations, but they are very active in boycotts and petitions compared to the counterparts in Europe and Latin America. Before the 1960s, the culture for activism was thought to be quite lacking in the United States due to the misguided belief that individuals were largely satisfied with the way the government was functioning. However, that myth was dispelled with the civil rights movement that began strongly in the 1960s and inspired a host of other liberation movements, from women's rights to Latinx American rights to LGBT rights. There are different classifications of levels of activism. Activism basically means volunteering or leading organizations that petition the government for change. Activists who oppose authoritarian measures are often labeled dissidents, and their ability to gain international recognition is oftentimes crucial for pressuring governments to change their policies. Community leaders are members of particular groups who hold positions of trust or authority for that community. Pastors, union workers, social workers, teachers, and the like, who are able to organize community-based resources to petition the government for change. Non-governmental governmental organizations are groups of activists who organize with the purpose of creating sustained work for change in one policy area. Social movements are groups of activists or groups of social movement organizations that seek to make change in a particular policy area, and they do so in a sustained fashion as well. These activists are all important to what scholars have recognized as cycles of protest, which produce two effects. The first effect is that they sometimes influence protest in another region or about another topic. The second effect is that protest cycles tend to have a lot of protests in a given period of time, and the previous cycle of protest often provides important activists, literature, resources, and lessons from the previous cycle. For example, many have noticed that the United States has become more protest-prone since Occupy Wall Street in 2011, which saw multiple sectors of society unite in opposing policies of banks that had received government bailout funds. Various movements today, including Occupy itself, are active in opposing many government policies today. Other forms of collective action are already identified are less sanctionable. A famous quote that seems to excuse political violence is, "War is the continuation of politics by other means," which is a pretty grim view of the world. To define those who engage in political violence as a form of collective action, rebels are individuals who arm themselves to oppose a government policy or action to do so, and do so violently. Revolutionaries are individuals who arm themselves in order to completely dismantle the government and replace it with a new form of government. The definition of terrorist is less definite, but the few commonalities scholars agree on are: they target non-combatants for political reasons, they use violence to terrorize, not traditional military maneuvers, and non-military confrontation is the purpose and goal. When it comes to national patterns of political participation in legitimate forms, the United States is often seen as a confusing case for a democratic state due to its low engagement. Robert Putnam's famous book, Bowling Alone, explores reasons for this and concludes that the forms of entertainment that drastically changed in the 20th century drove citizens into their homes instead of into bowling alleys and movie theaters and plays and other venues that engaged individuals publicly. In other words, the television killed social capital, that sense of community trust that favors a trading system basically to encourage engagement and democracy. In case you're wondering, Putnam isn't a big fan of the internet either. The book offers data about engagement online versus offline, and it seems there are some interesting points, such as that in-person engagement was at 48%, with the percentage of Americans reporting engaging and working with citizens on some type of public project, versus 39% of online engagement, like encouraging people to vote, posting thoughts and comments online, reposting political content, etc. Looking at that engagement further, we see that the differences between age groups and online participation versus offline participation emerge. Among younger generations, online activity is preferred, while among older generations, in-person activities are preferred. In the modern political environment, both liberals and conservatives may be involved in collective action for the achievement of relevant goals to the individual. That is, under the general framework of liberalism, which both liberals and conservatives in the modern framework support. Communitarians, on the other hand, are less friendly toward the idea of individual goal attainment, and they believe that political engagement, social movements, and collective action should be directed at creating new forms of government and better forms of community. As such, they may not be pursuing goals that fit within the system, and this makes them at odds with the political and legal system and sometimes causes them to be viewed as dangerous. Marxists tend to be communitarian, but so also are various religious sects. The big difference is that liberals and conservatives are comfortable with the existing structure and framework of the government, whereas communitarians may oppose it completely. We end this discussion by looking at the data on voter turnout across a selection of OECD states. This is Organization for Economic and Cooperation data. The United States falls pretty low on this list. The OECD average is around 68 to 70%, but the U.S. has less than 60% turnout for presidential elections. And finally, we end with a map of countries who have compulsory voting. Those who are in green are the countries where it is illegal not to vote.